Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another video, and hopefully a very exciting one today. Today I am delighted to be telling you the challenges for this year's Victober. So if you don't know what Victober is, let me tell you a little bit about it. Victober is a month-long readathon hosted by me and several other booktubers, all about celebrating Victorian literature. It has been running every October for quite a while now. This is the 9th of October, which feels mad, and it's just a fun celebration of Victorian books. And I'm joined this year by three wonderful hosts: Kate Howe, Marissa from Blatantly Bookish, and Roz from Scally Daddling About the Books. Petra, who joined us the last couple of years, has taken a bit of a step back from BookTube this year, so it's just the four of us this year. The only thing you need to do to take part in Victober is to read one work of Victorian literature during the month of October, and for the purposes of this readathon, the definition of Victorian literature we use is British or Irish literature published and or written between 1837 and 1901, which are the years of Queen Victoria's reign. You can also take part in Victober by posting anything on BookTube, BookTok, Bookstagram, wherever with the hashtag Victober, and you can also join our Discord server, which I'll link down below. But without any further ado, let me take you through this year's challenges. Kate's challenge is to read a Victorian book where religion is a component of the story. My challenge, Katie's challenge, is to read a Victorian book that plays with form in some way. I'll talk about this more in a minute, but that could mean a book that is in diary form or has multiple perspectives or a frame narrative. Marissa's challenge is to read a Victorian work that was originally serialised. Roz's challenge is to experience Victorian theatre, read, watch or listen to a Victorian play. And then the group challenge this year, which has been set by all of us, is to read a Victorian work by Wilkie Collins and or Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Our group challenge is obviously a bit more specific than our Victober challenges often are, but there is a very good reason for that. Me and the other hosts of Victober kind of wanted some way to honour both Jennifer Brooks and Alice and the Giant Bookshelf, who were two wonderful booktubers who have both passed away this year, and both of whom had taken part in Victober for a number of years, and I know, like, I will really miss their videos in Victober this year. And Jennifer Brooks absolutely loved Wilkie Collins, and Alice and the Giant Bookshelf really loved Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, especially his Sherlock Holmes stories. So we thought maybe this more specific challenge might be a nice way to honour both of them. And then our group read for Victober this year is The Doctor's Wife by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. I haven't actually read this before, and I feel like most of our group reads we've had in Victober past have been books that I've read before, but I have not read this. I know very little about it, but I have read a couple of books by Mary Elizabeth Braddon before. I have read both Lady Audley's Secret, which I really liked, and Aurora Floyd, which I liked not as much, but I did really enjoy her writing style. I really like the way she writes. She was a Victorian sensation writer, and her writing style is just like really pacey and dramatic, and I'm very curious to read The Doctor's Wife, which I've heard someone say is like the British take on Madame Bovary, and I didn't really like Madame Bovary, so I don't know how this could go, but I'm kind of excited. So I think we're going to be reading basically 2 chapters a day over the first like 18 days of October. That's the plan. I'm really excited. All the discussion for this will be taking place on the Discord server, so again, please do join that. And now I have a few recommendations for you for my own challenge. All the other Victober hosts will be giving recommendations for their challenges over on their videos, so do go and check them out. So as I have already said, my challenge is to read a Victorian book that plays with form in some way. So basically, I want you to read a work of Victorian literature that does something different with form. So this could be an epistolary novel, or a novel that is in diary form, a frame narrative, you know, a story within a story. It could be a novel that has a dual narrative, or it could be a novel in verse, or a collaborative work written by multiple authors. You could read an interconnected short story collection, or a short story collection with a frame narrative, but you can't just read a short story collection. Like, it has to be doing something with form. Just being a short story collection is not enough to be playing with form, if that makes sense. I think we could also probably stretch this prompt to include like episodical novels that don't have a kind of through narrative, and also novels that pretend not to be novels. Like in some of the early fantasy fiction that you see in the Victorian period, they're like pretending to be non-fiction accounts and travel writing. To be honest, if you're struggling with this prompt and you read a Victorian novel that features some letters, which a lot of them do, then I think you can probably probably stretch the prompt to count this, but there are a lot of books that play with form in really interesting ways that I would like to recommend to you. There are quite a lot of works of Victorian fiction that have some kind of frame narrative. A good example of that would be Wuthering Heights, which in fact has like many different frames, and in fact just plays with form in all the ways. This book starts off as a diary, and a man called Mr. Lockwood is recording in his diary the narrative that a woman called Nellie Dean is telling him, but within Nellie Dean's narrative she often like reports other people talking about what's happened to them. This is a wonderful gothic mysterious novel from 1847. It is not a love story in my opinion, it is very much a revenge novel, and a fantastic revenge novel it is. I'd also recommend a novella by H.G. Wells, The Time Machine from 1895. This again is a frame narrative. We start with one character who is present when a time traveller is telling the story of his travels. The Turn of the Screw by Henry James is a ghost story from 1898. We start with one character who is then told a story by another character about someone else he knew, and her story is then the bulk of the narrative. And The Turn of the Screw is a kind of gothic ghost story about a governess and her mysterious charges. I will be honest, I don't love The Turn of the Screw, but also it is very much a frame narrative, and it felt like weird not to mention it because I know that Henry James is for a lot of people, even if he just isn't really for me. I also kind of never know 100% whether to count him as Victorian because he was an American author, but he did move to Britain later in his life, became a British citizen, spent a lot of his time in the UK, and The Turn of the Screw is definitely set in the UK. I have no idea whether Henry James considered himself British or American more, and does it really matter? So, you know, I think it's fine to read Henry James for Victober is what I'm saying. Anyway, another book with a kind of light frame narrative is The Rebecca Writer. This book kind of starts off with a prologue and has a little epilogue purporting to be from a doctor who is writing down the experiences of a man who has told him his life story. It's the tale of some real riots that took place in Wales in the early 19th century, and it's just a really interesting book. Another book with a frame narrative is The House by the Churchyard by J. Sheridan Le Fanu, a work of historical Victorian fiction from 1864, set in the 18th century, although we have a bit of a frame narrative where someone in chapter 1 is present when someone's body is dug up in a churchyard, and this person's skull has some unusual injuries to it, and then we go back in time to the 18th century to find out what happened to this person. There's also The Struggles of Browns, Jones and Robinson by Anthony Trollope from 1862, which is both a frame narrative and kind of like pretending to be non-fiction in a way. So we start off with this kind of introduction where this man, Mr. Robinson, is kind of writing and saying, this is the true account of what happened to my business, and now I'm going to tell you what happened in this firm that I was part of. So the rest of the novel is kind of purporting to be from his perspective, but it's all in third person. But the kind of conceit overall is that he has written this account and is biased, and it's excellent fun. And Elizabeth Gaskell also uses frame narratives sometimes in her shorter works. The Grey Woman is a great gothic novella by her from 1865, which starts off with this conceit of these two people in an inn who stumble across this unusual story, and the rest of the novella is that story. And The Poor Clare from 1856 is another interesting gothic Gaskell work, which kind of uses frame narrative devices and also like an unusual perspective. So we have a first person narrator narrating bits of the story, but he also narrates a lot of stuff that he isn't present for. In general, I feel like Victorian frame narratives fascinate me because I feel like the reasons that they're used are really interesting. Like, they're often used in works of gothic Victorian fiction to kind of add an element of mystery, but also authenticity. You know, this isn't just a story we've made up. I went to this place and I found this mysterious manuscript. You also sometimes find frame narratives used to give a woman's narrative or the narrative of a working class man within the like frame of a middle class man. That's something I find really interesting. It's almost like a Victorian writer thinks, well, in order to lend this story like credibility, I must pretend that it's a middle class man who is number one narrator, even if there's other narrators behind it. Troubling and fascinating. Anyway, another book that uses perspective in a really interesting way is Wilder's Hand by J. Sheridan Le Fanu. So this is a book from 1864 that I loved. I read this earlier this year, and a bit like Unlike A Poor Clare by Elizabeth Gaskell, it is a book in first-person perspective, but the first-person narrator very often describes things that he didn't witness, which means it kind of has a dual narrative feel where we switch between first-person and third-person, but also the idea is that the first-person narrator is writing everything, but he didn't witness everything, which I just find really odd, but kind of works, and it's just a really wonderful, glorious, mysterious book. I feel like I don't want to tell you too much about Wilder's Hand, but it involves a mystery, an inheritance, a broken-off marriage, a disappearance, and it's generally just great. Alternatively, for this challenge, you could read a book that is in the form of letters or diaries in some way or another. One great example of this would be The Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Anne Bronte. We start in epistolary form with a letter written by a man called Gilbert Markham to his friends, and then within this letter, Gilbert ends up enclosing the diary of a woman called Helen Graham. It's hard to know what exactly to tell you about this book, but we begin with Gilbert meeting the mysterious widowed Helen Graham. He is starting to feel increasingly drawn to her, and one day she gives him her diary in order to tell him about her past. It's just a fantastic book, and it plays with form in a really interesting way. If you want a quick read, I'd also recommend Diary of a Nobody by George and Weedon Grossmith. This is a really fun diary form novella from 1892, charting the adventures of Mr. Pooter and his wife. So this book kind of looks at social mobility and class in a really interesting way, as well as just being a thoroughly enjoyable read. So I very much recommend this one. And another very short diary form book is this. This is Elizabeth and Her German Garden by Elizabeth von Arnim. Elizabeth von Arnim is often thought of as a early 20th century writer, and the other book by her I've read, The Enchanted April, is from the 1920s, I think. But she actually published this during the Victorian period in 1898. And this is a kind of semi-autobiographical, episodical novella in diary form, looking at the life of this woman and kind of how her garden brings her joy. And then Wilkie Collins is an author who plays with form in lots of really, really interesting ways in his book. So Armadale from 1866 is a fantastic, fantastic Wilkie Collins novel. This book has a lot of letters in and also has big sections in diary form. I love this book so much. This is one of my favourite Wilkie Collins books, and it's really underrated, I think. The premise kind of revolves around the fact that there are two people with the same name, but it's kind of hard to explain more than that, but it is really fantastic and I definitely recommend it. Then The Moonstone from 1868 also plays with form a lot. We have a lot of different perspectives in this book. I love the way The Moonstone plays with perspective, and it's something that works really, really well for this novel's premise, because this book is all about a stolen diamond, and we learn about this diamond and what has happened to it through lots and lots of different perspectives. And then there's also The Woman in White from 1860, which again has a lot of different perspectives, some kind of just first person past tense looking back, and then some in diary form, and I really love the way The Woman in White plays with form. I think it's such an interesting novel. Another very well-known Victorian work that plays a lot with form and different perspectives is Dracula by Bram Stoker from 1897. This book has a lot of different perspectives and uses lots of different forms. I think there's some diaries, there's definitely some letters. I think one of the characters is like narrating into a dictaphone. I think that's right. It's been a long time since I read Dracula. As I have said before in this channel, I do not love Dracula. It is one of my least favourite books ever, but it does play with form in a really interesting way, so I do feel like I ought to recommend it for this challenge anyway. A 1890s horror novel that I like a lot more than Dracula is The Beetle by Richard Marsh. This came out in 1897 and at the time was as popular, if not more popular, I think, than Dracula. There are some elements of it that don't age particularly well, but like that is very much true of Dracula too, and I think The Beetle is a much better narrative. The Beetle is told from 4 different perspectives, kind of one block at a time. We see sort of the first quarter of the story from one person's perspective, then move to another perspective. Another really interesting book that plays with form is Bleak House by Charles Dickens from 1853. This book is quite long, but it's very much worth your time, I promise. And this is a dual narrative. So half the novel is told in first person past tense perspective from the character of Esther Summerson, and the other half of the novel is told in third person present tense following all of the other characters around her. This book basically all revolves around a complicated legal case, and I love it a lot. Another book that would work for this challenge is A Study in Scarlet by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle from 1887, which is a kind of dual narrative, or like book in 2 parts. Remember the first time I was listening to The Study in Scarlet on audiobook, and we got to halfway through the book and suddenly we moved away from Watson and Sherlock Holmes to a completely new character in a completely new setting, and I was like, has this audiobook gone wrong? Is this a new book? But no, it is just The Study in Scarlet. halfway through the book, we just move to a whole new set of characters in third person, follow their story. Or if you like, you could read a novel in verse. The two that I have read from the Victorian period are Aurora Leigh by Elizabeth Barrett Browning from 1856, which I really enjoyed. This is a great proto-feminist coming-of-age story written in verse. Or you could read The Ring and the Book by Robert Browning, her husband, from 1868, which is a novel in verse all about a murder trial. I will say that I found The Ring and the Book quite a lot less accessible than Aurora Leigh, but I did still really enjoy it. As I said earlier, I think you could also count for this challenge those Victorian kind of fantasy novels that pretend that they are travel writing, or that sort of like have a conceit of being travel writing throughout them as part of their form and structure, such as read-a-thon by Samuel Butler from 1872, all about a traveller who discovers this other world. As I also said earlier, I reckon we could stretch this prompt to count for any episodical novels which don't have a through plot. So something like The Pickwick Papers by Charles Dickens would count for this. This also has lots of like short stories embedded in it where Mr. Pickwick and his friends go to somewhere and get told a random short story by someone. Or you could read Cranford by Elizabeth Gaskell, another mostly episodical novel set in a very small town where all the kind of like middle and upper class people who live there are women, and they run this town. I really recommend Cranford, absolutely hilarious, one of my favourite things from the Victorian period. Or you could read My Flirtations by Ella Hepworth Dixon from 1892, which is a novel in the form of like vignettes just about the main character's flirtations. She basically has like 13 chapters talking about each of the men that she has flirted with in her time, and it is very funny and entertaining and really worth your time. The other thing you could read for this challenge is a interconnected short story collection, or a short story collection with some kind of frame narrative. So one example of this would be Round the Sofa by Elizabeth Gaskell from 1859. This is a collection of short stories with a frame narrative. The idea being that the kind of frame narrator is unwell, so she's kind of like bound to her sofa. She can't really move around very much, and people come and tell her stories, and a lot of the rest of the book is those stories. And a kind of similar book is Mugby Junction by Charles Dickens and others. So Charles Dickens kind of wrote the frame narrative about this like junction, and then we follow lots of different stories kind of on different train lines leading off from this junction. So there's some stories by Charles Dickens, and there's also a story by Andrew Halliday, Charles Collins and Hester Stretton. And in fact, this collection includes like The Signalman, which is one of Dickens's most famous stories, but I really recommend Mugby Junction as a whole. I really enjoyed this one. And then two books on a very similar model to Mugby Junction that I haven't yet read would be A House to Let from 1858 and The Haunted House from 1859. So these again are like interconnected short stories with a frame narrative co-written by lots of different writers. So I think both of those books contain stories by Elizabeth Gaskell, Wilkie Collins, Charles Dickens and Adelaide Ann Proctor, and then The Haunted House also has a story by Hester Stretton and George Sala in as well. And then finally, one other book which I haven't yet read but I would quite like to read for this challenge this year, one book that I think is going to be quite high up on my TBR. This is one I heard about last year, and it's called The Fate of Fenella, and it's an experimental novel featuring 24 chapters, each written by a different best-selling Victorian author without any collaboration from the other authors. So basically I think an author would like get the previous chapters and then write what happened next without discussing it with anyone else, which just sounds kind of wild. I think that both Bram Stoker and Sir Arthur Conan Doyle contributed a chapter. I didn't recognise that many of the other names, but this was from the 1890s, and it just sounds fascinating. And of course there are no doubt many, many more works of Victorian literature that play with form in some way. I did also in this video want to give a few recommendations for the group challenge. Obviously I've already mentioned both Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and Wilkie Collins in this video. Both of them have books that would work for my challenge too, and you are always free to double up on challenges when it comes to Victober, but I did want to give a few other recommendations too. When it comes to Wilkie Collins, to be honest, three of my favourites of his books would be The Moonstone, The Woman in White and Armadale. As I said earlier, I think The Moonstone is probably my favourite, and then Armadale would be maybe second, and then third would probably be Man and Wife, which is a fantastic, fantastic Collins book that I read last Victober and just absolutely loved. I thought Man and Wife was so fantastic, such a compelling, dramatic, pacey novel. A slightly slow start, but like once you get past a slightly slow start, it's fantastic, and some of the characterization in that is like Wilkie Collins at his best. I also personally quite like Poor Miss Finch, which I feel like is not one of Wilkie Collins' best love novels, but it's one that I really like. Wilkie Collins in general is an author I have a bit of a like love-hate relationship with. I have absolutely loved some of his books, and I have really struggled with some of his other books, but I have read 13 of his books, so I think you can tell that there is quite a lot of love there. When it comes to Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, it is probably worth you checking the publication dates for what you're reading by him, because obviously he was a Victorian writer writing in the Victorian period, but he also kept writing into the 20th century. So I think the Sherlock Holmes books that are technically Victorian are A Study in Scarlet from 1887, The Sign of the Four from 1890, The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, which is a short story collection from 1892, and The Memoirs of Sherlock Holmes, another short story collection from 1894. I mean, Queen Victoria died in January 1901, and The Hound of the Baskervilles was serialised in the Strand magazine from August 1901 to April 1902, so like it started coming out a few months after Queen Victoria's death. And you know, if you want to read The Hound of the Baskervilles in Victober, the Victober police will not come after you, like it's fine. Personally, when it comes to Sherlock Holmes, I actually much prefer the short stories to the novels. I like some of the novels, especially The Hound of the Baskervilles, but in general I much prefer the Sherlock Holmes short stories, which I really enjoy. I've got a bind up here of The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes and The Memoirs of Sherlock Holmes, and I've also got the massive and wonderful audiobook of every Sherlock Holmes work, narrated by Stephen Fry. I'm sure I will be rereading / listening to some of the Sherlock Holmes short stories this October. But of course, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle didn't only write the Sherlock Holmes stories, and in fact we know that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle didn't really love Sherlock Holmes, and there's like a really sad quote where he said something like, "If I'm only remembered for Sherlock Holmes, I'll consider myself a failure." And you know, poor Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, I'm afraid he is chiefly remembered for Sherlock Holmes. But he also wrote a bunch of historical fiction as well as other things, and I think one thing I might try this Victober is some of his works of historical fiction. I found an audiobook of a book called The White Company, set in the 14th century during the 100 Years' War, so I might give that a try this Victober. There is a lot of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle out there beyond his Sherlock Holmes stories. So I think I've given you enough recommendations to be getting on with, and I also feel like this video has already been far too long for an announcement video. But before I go, I did want to talk about a couple of my content ideas this Victober. I will have a TBR up at some point in September, of course. I will be doing some vlogs here and there in October, and then I have a few ideas which I thought might be fun. One thing I would like to do is, I've now read a Victorian book from every year of the Victorian period, so I thought I might do a like recommendations for every year of the Victorian period video at some point. I'm also going to be making some content like relating to the Mega Dickens read along, which is ending in September. Like, we have our final book in September, so I might do a kind of like video about chronological reading and my kind of experiences reading Dickens in publication order. And I'm also going to do like a really massive tier ranking all of Dickens's novels by like lots of different categories, which I'm really looking forward to. I'm also going to do a kind of Anthony Trollope check-in, because people have been asking me how I'm getting on with trying to read all of Anthony Trollope's books, and I think I only have like 13 left, so I'm going to do a video kind of talking about how I'm doing with my Anthony Trollope goals. I'll probably also have 1 or 2 like 5 Victorian novels about videos at some point. I'd also like to do a video kind of talking through my like special beautiful editions of classics, and I also thought I might do a video talking about like hypothetical PhDs in Victorian literature that I will never actually do, but that I've had fun like thinking about what a good title would be. And then I had another idea that I really want to do, but basically will really depend on like time and how much time I have in October, because it would be quite time consuming, and I'm really hoping I will manage to fit it in, but I might not. And if I don't fit it in this Victober, maybe another year. But basically I would quite like to do a kind of like A to Z of Victorian authors, which will probably be split into multiple videos posted every day for a week, going through as many novelists, short story writers, poets, playwrights, non-fiction writers from the Victorian period as I can think of, talking about who they were, what they wrote, where I'd recommend starting with their work if I've read them, and that kind of thing. I feel like that would be fun and also quite useful. I was looking through my list of like Victorian authors that I've read, and I've read stuff from 78 different Victorian writers, and if I look through my TBR, I'm sure I'll find a lot more, so I reckon we can get up to at least 100. But if you have any like really underrated or forgotten Victorian authors that you love, please do let me know down in the comments, and I will try and add them to my list and my database, and hopefully I'll manage to gather this together by the end of October. I don't know, it might be too ambitious. I would really like to try, but it will depend on work stuff. So I feel like we've finally reached the end of everything I have to say in this video. I'm excited for another Victober. I hope you are too. I think it's going to be good fun. I'm really excited about our challenges this year, and I need to start putting together my TBR and working out all the many books I want to read in October. Please do let me know down in the comments, are you going to take part in Victober? What are you excited to read? If you make a TBR video, please do tag me because I would love to see that. Otherwise, that's all for now. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.